Imagine a machine so fast that it could outrun the speed of sound in a dive. Imagine a plane that didn't use a propeller or a jet engine, but a controlled explosion to hurl itself into the stratosphere. Now imagine that the fuel powering this machine was so corrosive that if a single drop touched your skin, it wouldn't just burn you, it would dissolve you. The date is August 16, 1944, a German airfield near Brandis. A pilot is screaming inside his cockpit. He hasn't been shot, he hasn't crashed, but a fuel line has ruptured. The liquid spraying onto his flight suit is T-Stoff, a substance so volatile that it eats through organic matter like acid through tissue paper. The ground crews run toward the plane, but they are too late. When they open the canopy, there is no body left to bury. There is only a jelly-like substance inside a flight suit. This was the Messerschmitt Me 163 Komet, the world's first and only operational rocket fighter. It was a marvel of engineering. It was the fastest thing in the sky, and it killed more of its own pilots than it killed the enemy. Today, we declassify the chemistry of the Devil's Brew and the horrific story of the plane that melted its own crews. To understand why Nazi Germany built a suicide machine, we must solve mystery number one. Why did they need it? It is 1944. The Allied bombing campaign is destroying Germany. Thousands of B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators are blotting out the sun. The German Luftwaffe is crumbling. Their standard fighter planes, the Messerschmitt 109s and F-Wolf 190s, take 20 minutes to climb to 30,000 feet to intercept the bombers. By the time they get there, the bombs have already dropped and the cities are burning. Germany needed a miracle. They needed an interceptor that could climb vertically. They needed a plane that could go from the ground to 30,000 feet in under 3 minutes. They needed speed so great that the American gunners couldn't track it. They turned to a genius and a madman named Alexander Lippisch. He designed a plane that looked like a bat. It had no tail, it had swept-back wings, and it had no landing gear. It was essentially a glider strapped to a bomb. A normal engine couldn't produce the power needed for a vertical climb, so the engineers turned to rocket propulsion. They installed the Walter HWK 109-509 liquid propellant rocket engine. It produced 3,800 pounds of thrust. It was a beast. But a rocket needs fuel, and this is where the story turns into a horror movie. The engineers couldn't use gasoline. They needed hypergolic fuels. Fuels that ignite instantly when they touch each other without a spark. This brings us to the deadliest part of the Komet, the fuel tanks. The plane carried two liquids. The first was C-Stoff. It was a mixture of methanol, hydrazine, and water. It was toxic. It smelled like rotting fish. If you inhaled the fumes, it would attack your nervous system. But C-Stoff was the safe one. The second liquid was T-Stoff. This was the nightmare fluid. It was 80% high-test peroxide. You might have hydrogen peroxide in your bathroom cabinet to clean cuts. That is 3% strength. At 80%, peroxide is no longer a cleaner. It is an oxidizer so powerful that it will spontaneously combust if it touches cloth, leather, or human skin. It doesn't burn. It decomposes organic matter instantly, turning it into heat and sludge. The engine worked by mixing these two hellish liquids in a combustion chamber. When T-Stoff touched C-Stoff, they exploded with the force of a bomb, shooting hot gas out of the back of the plane. But the plane was small. The pilots were literally sitting on top of the fuel tanks. There was a T-Stoff tank right behind the pilot's head. There were C-Stoff tanks in the wings. The pilot was sandwiched between two liquids that would explode if they mixed and dissolve him if they leaked. It was like flying a Molotov cocktail. To make matters worse, T-Stoff was unstable. It reacted with metal. If you put it in a steel tank, the tank would dissolve. So the engineers had to build the fuel tanks out of aluminum or coated glass. But even a speck of dust or a piece of rust in the fuel line could trigger an explosion. The ground crews had to wear thick rubber suits and wash down the plane with water constantly. If T-Stoff dripped onto the runway, the asphalt would catch fire. Imagine you were a young German pilot. You were strapped into the tiny cockpit, you were wearing a special rubber suit designed to protect you from the fuel, but you know that if the tank ruptures, the suit will just melt to your skin. You look out the window. The wings are swept back. The nose is pointed up at a 45-degree angle. You are sitting on a dolly, two wheels that will drop off as soon as you leave the ground. You have no landing gear. Once you take off, you have to land on a metal skid on the belly of the plane. You ignite the engine. The acceleration is violent. You are pushed back into your seat with a force that makes it hard to breathe. The plane rockets down the runway. At 170 miles per hour, you pull back on the stick. The wheels drop away. You are airborne. But you don't fly like a normal plane. You climb like a missile. The Komet climbs at a 70-degree angle. The sky turns from blue to black in minutes. The speed is addictive. You reach 596 miles per hour. You are approaching the speed of sound. But here you face a new enemy, Mach tuck. As the plane nears the sound barrier, shock waves form over the wings. The controls freeze. The nose of the plane is forced down. If you go too fast, the plane will tumble out of control and rip itself apart. The pilot has to fight the stick with both hands just to keep the plane from diving into the ground. You level off at 30,000 feet. You have only used 3 minutes of fuel. You have about 4 minutes left to find the American bombers, attack them, and get out. You spot a formation of B-17s below you. They look like slow-moving turtles. You dive. To the American bomber crews, the appearance of the Komet was a shock. They were used to fighting propeller planes that moved at 300 miles per hour. Suddenly, they saw a white streak of smoke rising from the ground. A tiny, tailless, bat-like shape zoomed through their formation so fast that their gun turrets couldn't track it. It was there, and then it was gone. They called it the powered egg. But speed was also a curse. The Komet was too fast. The pilot had only a split second to aim his 30-millimeter cannons. By the time he lined up the shot, he had already passed the bomber. The closing speed was over 600 miles per hour. It was like trying to read a road sign while driving a Formula One car. Most Komet pilots missed. They would zoom past, turn around, and realize they were out of fuel. Once the rocket fuel ran out, the Komet became a glider, a very heavy, very fast glider. The pilot was now defenseless. He had to glide back to his base. This is when the American fighters pounced. The P-51 Mustangs would wait above the German airfields. They knew the Komets had to come down. They would dive on the gliding Komets and shoot them down while they were helpless. The hunter became the prey. But the most dangerous part of the mission wasn't the Americans. It was the landing. The Komet had no wheels. It had to land on a metal skid that extended from the belly. The pilot had to bring the plane in at 140 miles per hour. If he came in too fast, he would bounce. If he came in too slow, he would stall and crash. And if he landed too hard, the remaining fumes in the fuel tanks would explode. This brings us to the gruesome reality of the casualties. The Messerschmitt Me-163 Komet killed more German pilots in accidents than it shot down Allied bombers. The landing was a game of Russian roulette. The impact of the skid hitting the ground often ruptured the fuel lines. Remember, T-Stoff and C-Stoff explode on contact. Many Komets touched down, slid for a few hundred yards, and then simply disintegrated in a ball of white chemical fire. The pilot trapped inside didn't burn. He was atomized.
The statistics of the Me-163 Komet are grim, but numbers don't bleed. To understand the true horror of this machine, we have to look at the story of Oberleutnant Josef Pohs. Pohs was not a rookie. He was a celebrated ace. He had shot down 43 enemy planes. He was a Knight's Cross holder. He was one of the best pilots Germany had. On December 30th, 1943, Pohs climbed into the cockpit of a Komet for a test flight. The takeoff was perfect. The climb was perfect. But as he prepared to land, something went wrong. He released the landing skid too early. The plane bounced violently on the runway. One of the fuel lines, T-Stoff, ruptured. The plane didn't explode, it skidded to a halt. The ground crews rushed toward the aircraft, expecting to pull Pohs out of the wreckage. The canopy was intact, the plane looked mostly undamaged, but when they looked inside, they saw a sight that haunted them for the rest of their lives. Pohs was waving his arms frantically. He was screaming, but no sound was coming out. The T-Stoff had leaked into the cockpit. It had soaked into his flight suit. The chemical reaction had begun. It wasn't a fire with flames, it was a chemical decomposition. The peroxide was reacting with the organic wool of his uniform and the proteins of his skin. It was literally dissolving him alive. The crews tried to open the canopy, but the heat had fused the latch shut. By the time they smashed the glass, it was too late. The official report stated that he died of injuries sustained in the crash, but the men who were there knew the truth. They said his body had been reduced to a jelly-like substance. His bones were visible. The T-Stoff had eaten him from the outside in. He didn't die from the impact. He died because his own fuel decided that he was fuel. Imagine being a pilot in the JG-400, the unit assigned to fly the Komet. You watch your friends die, not in combat, but in training accidents. You watch them explode on the runway. You watch them dissolve in their seats. And then the siren sounds. The American bombers are coming. You have to climb into that same machine, strap yourself onto a tank of acid, and fly into battle. The courage required to fly the Komet was almost suicidal. The pilots joked that they had a short life expectancy, but a fast one. They were the elite of the elite, but they were fighting a war they knew they couldn't win. The Komet was a weapon of desperation. It was a sign that the Nazi regime was willing to sacrifice its best men for a technological gamble. Even if you survived the takeoff and the landing, the combat was frustrating. The Komet was too fast for its own good. Pilots reported diving on B-17 formations, firing their cannons, and seeing the shells bounce off. The 30mm Mk-108 cannon had a low muzzle velocity. At 600 miles per hour, the ballistics were a nightmare. You had to lead the target by hundreds of yards. Most pilots ran out of ammo without scoring a single hit. For the Allies, the Komet was a mystery. They saw it zip through their formations, but they rarely saw it shoot anyone down. They called it the powered flea, but they respected the technology. When the war ended, American and British intelligence teams raced to capture the Komet bases. They wanted the secrets of the rocket engine. When the Americans captured the Brandes airfield in 1945, they found dozens of Komets sitting on the tarmac. Some were sabotaged, some were intact. They also found the T-Stoff storage tanks. The American engineers were horrified when they tested the fuel. They realized that the Germans had been flying planes powered by a substance that was too dangerous for industrial use, let alone aviation. One American chemist reportedly said, "You'd be mad to put this in a plane." The Me-163 Komet was a tactical failure. It shot down only 9 to 16 Allied bombers in the entire war. In exchange, Germany lost dozens of Komets and many of its best pilots to accidents. It was an inefficient, expensive, and deadly mistake. But it was a technological triumph. It was the first plane to break the 1,000 km/h barrier in level flight. It pioneered the swept wing design that would later be used on the F-86 Sabre and the MiG-15. It proved that rocket flight was possible. The DNA of the Komet lives on in every modern jet fighter and every space rocket. Alexander Lippisch, the designer, was taken to the United States under Operation Paperclip. He went on to work for Convair and helped design the Delta wing aircraft that became the F-102 Delta Dagger and the F-106 Delta Dart. The man who built the suicide plane for Hitler ended up building the supersonic interceptors for the U.S. Air Force. Today, a few Me-163 Komets survive in museums. You can see them in Washington, London, and Munich. They look small. They look almost like toys. But if you look closely at the cockpit, you can see the cramped space where a man sat sandwiched between tanks of liquid death. You can see the skid that had to land at 140 miles per hour. The story of the Komet is a warning. It is a warning about what happens when engineering is divorced from humanity. The Nazi regime didn't care about the safety of its pilots. It only cared about the performance of the machine. They built a plane that was faster than anything on Earth, but it was a machine that consumed its creators. Josef Pohs and the other pilots of JG-400 were not killed by the enemy. They were killed by their own ambition. They rode the lightning, and they paid the price in fire and acid. The comet was the ultimate wonder weapon, a marvel of science that was also a tomb.